Welcome back to Face the Nation, and we continue our conversation now with our foreign policy panel. H.R. McMaster, General McMaster, I want to ask you from a military perspective. We heard the CIA director describe a full-fledged military partnership between Russia and Iran. What does this look like?
Well, I think where it heads next is support for Russia's war-making machine more broadly. I think you're going to see missiles. You already have reports of Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps trainers and assemblers of these drones. And I think what we're recognizing is these problem sets that we're facing with the theocratic dictatorship in Iran and the revanchist hyper-nationalist Putin, they're connected to each other. And they're connected to China. So I think we are hopefully now in full recognition that we are in really consequential competitions with authoritarian regimes who are hostile to us. And we have to respond much more effectively than we responded in the past. And that's a broad range of, I think, preparations for potential military conflict so we can deter a widening of the war. But there's also very significant economic and diplomatic aspects of these interconnected problems.
One of the things you're saying there is recognize that the attempt to broker a nuclear deal with Iran is dead.
It's a pipe dream. It's trying to revive something that is completely dead. And I couldn't believe it, Margaret, as we were supplicating to the Iranian regime as they're intensifying their proxy war in the region and attacking some of our long-standing partners there. And I think we lost a lot of ground in the Middle East because we're chasing this pipe dream of trying to revive this nuclear agreement. And if we didn't, what would happen is we'd give Iran a pass on the destructive effect the dictatorship has had on the Iranian economy. If we're going to be in the business of making predictions, I think the chances are quite high of a significant conflict in the Middle East, maybe entailing an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program.
Michelle Flournoy, do you agree with that assessment?
The real risk is that in 2023, they will acquire enough material, and highly enriched nuclear material, to build a bomb. Israel has long articulated that as a red line, that is an unacceptable condition for them to have, to coexist with. And then the decision that places on the U.S. president's desk, do we support them? Do we stand back? What happens? And do we find ourselves in an escalating situation with Iran in the Middle East?
And, Mike, the intelligence community has not determined that Iran actually will make a nuclear weapon. It's just that they're giving themselves the possibility to do so at a future date.
The judgment has always been that what the Iranians want is to get to the threshold, right, to have all the pieces and be able to put them together quickly. Right now, they have enough fissile material enriched to 60% for 4 bombs, and they could get to 90%, which is what is required for a weapon, in a matter of weeks. So in terms of fissile material piece, they're very, very close.
Does the regime, which has withstood many popular protests, withstand what's happening in the streets, which is unique with these protests that were started by young women?
Yeah. I think you have to look at the current protest in the context of a series of protests that have occurred since 2017. They've all had different causes, but the one thing they have in common is a growing alienation of the young people from the regime, and a growing group of people who want a more normal life and a less rigid life. But at the same time, there's a large number of Iranians who support the regime. 18 million people voted for the current president, who's a hardliner. So I don't think that we're going to see regime change unless there's an incident that takes us in a different direction.
It is so fascinating that the dynamic is there, that it's women who started this round of protests. And it makes me think, Michelle, of time and again, as expected, it is the young women who are paying the price for what's happening in Afghanistan following the withdrawal of the United States. Do you buy the argument that that choice to withdraw factored in any way to Russia and China's assessment that the U.S. was in decline?
It's one brick in a wall that they've been building for quite some time that has many bricks, which is why it's so important that we need to invest in our alliances, really demonstrate our credibility when we make foreign policy commitments and so forth. I actually would give the administration some credit for that in terms of pulling NATO together after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, building stronger partnerships in Asia to try to deter and counterbalance China.
Are you optimistic that those alliances in the West will actually remain solid? Because there is an argument that if Vladimir Putin hadn't bombed Kyiv and terrified European leaders, that they wouldn't be united. That it's not just diplomacy, it was actual fear.
But we are where we are. And I think the NATO alliance and the US-EU relationship, they have found their purpose again. There's a tremendous amount of transatlantic unity that I think is quite solid. I also think as Beijing overplays their hand, that actually bolsters our alliances and our partnerships in the region. But we have to play our cards well and seriously compete, not only diplomatically, but shoring up deterrence militarily, competing economically, technologically, keeping our edge, making the right investments at home.
Ambassador Sullivan, you're not at the State Department anymore, so you can speak freely. How much of the withdrawal, how it was executed, and the agreement with the Taliban is responsible for shaping the perception of weakness of the West?
I completely agree with Michelle that the Russians, Beijing, they will use any misstep by the United States, real or imagined, against us in their false narrative. Unfortunately, in this case, we did make a major misstep. I think, particularly in how we implemented the withdrawal. There's no doubt in my mind that it factored in, at least in some way, in the Russians' calculation about our strength, our ability to convince allies and partners to oppose what the Russians were doing, our credibility. Did it ultimately turn out to be the case? No. As with so many things, Putin was wrong about that, too.
Mike, after the fall of Kabul, you were on this program and you correctly forecast that the Taliban knew where al-Qaeda's leader was inside Afghanistan.
Right.
So I'm wondering what your thought is about where the emerging terror threat is now.
So al-Qaeda is a problem that needs to be watched in Afghanistan. The bigger problem in Afghanistan at the moment is ISIS. They are increasingly recruiting from neighboring countries, and those individuals are coming in where they're getting training from ISIS, and the concern is that they might leave Afghanistan, go back to their home countries, and conduct attacks against Western interests. Think embassies. The bigger terrorism problem is actually in Africa, all the way from Somalia all the way to West Africa, where you've got both al-Qaeda affiliates and you've got ISIS affiliates. They have control huge swaths of territory. They've conducted primarily local attacks so far, but at some point, Western embassies, Western military bases in both Africa and possibly in Europe could become targets. And if we're going to make a prediction for 2023, I'd say we're going to see a terrorist attack against a Western interest somewhere in the world.
Well, that's terrifying. It's sobering. It's a reminder that declaring victory was too early.
Terrorism has always waxed and waned. It has always gone up and down, and I think it's starting to bounce back again.
General McMaster, do you agree with that assessment that the emergent threat is coming out of Africa?
I do, but it's also coming out of Afghanistan, and it's also coming out of the Middle East still. And ISIS in Syria has not been defeated. And the main lesson from 9/11 is that jihadist threats that develop abroad can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. So sustained engagement through partners, like the partners we abandoned in Afghanistan, is really critical to our own safety and security.
I want to transition to the other looming threat that you hear the administration saying it will turn its eye towards in the new year, and that is China. Michelle Flournoy, where do you begin to try to de-escalate?
Well, I think there is a desire to sort of right the apple cart. That said, neither side is going to change its fundamental interests, and those interests are in many ways in conflict. So there is a competition ongoing, and it's economic, it's technological, it's informational, it's political, it's military. I think the real name of the game in 2023 is shoring up deterrence. I don't think President Xi wants to move on Taiwan. He's got, COVID to deal with. He's got a youth unemployment problem to deal with. He's got all kinds of domestic challenges. And I think he'd prefer to take Taiwan using economic and political coercion ultimately. But he has instructed his military, be ready by 2027. So we've got the next few years to really make sure that he cannot have confidence in his ability to succeed militarily. So that means we have a lot of investment to do alongside investing in the drivers of our economic competitiveness, our technological competitiveness as well.
Ambassador Sullivan, how does Secretary Blinken approach this sort of trying to defrost this frozen relationship?
We're not going to do this alone. We just saw the Japanese government announcing its new national security and defense strategy, significantly increasing its defense budget. Our European allies and partners becoming more forthright about the threat that they see, the challenges they see from China.
And I want to get to General McMaster, because I know you spend a lot of time on thinking about China. How do you see it?
It's a grave threat. I think Xi Jinping means what he says, right? I think we have to be careful not to mirror image, not to fall into the same traps we did with Vladimir Putin of confirmation bias and optimism bias. Xi Jinping has made quite clear in his statements that he's going to make, from his perspective, China whole again by subsuming Taiwan. And the preparations are underway. So I think what is important is what Michelle said, deterrence, but good old-fashioned deterrence by denial. I mean, hard power matters. And I think we are underinvested in defense in the United States. China has become increasingly aggressive, not only from an economic and financial perspective and a wolf warrior diplomacy perspective, but physically with its military. And what's really disturbing is I think Xi Jinping is preparing the Chinese people for war. In some of his speeches, he said, well, for us to restore China to national greatness, it's going to take some sacrifices. So I think we have to take it very seriously and act to extend really our power. We talk a lot about relying on our allies, and then maybe if we take a step back, the allies will do more. I think actually the opposite is the case. If Americans just do a little bit more, many of our allies will follow suit and bolster their defense capabilities and capacity as well.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be right back. We now want to go to Ben Tracy, Senior National and Environmental Correspondent out in Los Angeles, and welcome Kevin Book, an energy analyst and currently the Managing Director of Clearview Energy Partners. Ben, I want to start with you because I don't want to just admire the problem. I want to talk about how to plan for what's ahead and what is being done. And I know out in California, you've had for a long time concern about drought in the West. Then you have these predictions from NASA about flooding here in the East, really at record levels. So what is happening? What do people need to plan for?
Well, when we talk about climate change, you're basically talking about extremes, right? So the extremes get more extreme. So as you said, out here in the West, we're talking about hotter and drier, and that's created this 23-year-long mega drought that we're suffering through. And then in the East, as you mentioned, there's flooding. And so you're seeing when you get these rainstorms, they're often kind of supercharged, and you're getting more flooding out of that. Out here in the West, the real plan is how do you kind of forecast and deal with water supplies when you're talking about hotter and drier as the long-term trend. So when you get more rain and less snow, you have less snowpack up in the mountains, and that is creating this crisis out here with reservoirs, with the Colorado River, and that's really impacting millions of people when it comes to the water supply. So it's hard to plan for, but you now have the federal government coming out here in the West and saying, okay, states, you got to get together and figure out how you're going to use this water supply, or we're going to start imposing some pretty significant cuts on you if you don't do it yourselves.
But at the federal level, Ben, we saw this historic investment, $369 billion as part of this Inflation Reduction Act. And the argument that all of this was ultimately supposed to alleviate climate change, but near term, it's really an investment in green energy. What difference is it going to make?
It is a huge investment, and it could make a huge difference. The analysis of the bill shows that this really could get us to about a 40% cut in U.S. emissions by the year 2030. So that's huge. And so much of that comes from these investments in the power grid and in renewable energy. And in fact, the International Energy Agency came out and revised their forecast and said that that transition is actually accelerating, that we're going to see renewable energy overtake coal as the predominant energy supply worldwide by the year 2025.
Kevin, you look at this from the perspective of investment and planning. So what is the biggest change that's coming in 2023? I mean, we hear all about this money being spent on incentivizing people to buy electric vehicles, for example. Is that the upshot?
It's a big topic right now because Europe's not happy about the incentives we're giving domestic manufacturing. But really, we're coming into 2023 on the heels of big energy security changes, big risks to the existing capacity. When you talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, one of the parts of the bill is that it keeps existing nuclear capacity on stream. The challenge is to keep clean electricity on the grid as you're adding new clean electricity to the grid and not losing it.
And nuclear being clean.
And nuclear is a clean, emissions-free resource. And so there's no equivalent, by the way, for hydro. You can't use a tax credit to make it snow in the Sierra Nevadas. But in the meantime, we have to make sure we don't go dark before we go green. And so existing fossil resources are very front and center as we go into the year. Russian fossil energy exports, about 5% of global consumption, are now being shunned by the West. And that's on top of an investment wave that is slowed considerably after the demand collapse of the pandemic. And so we're going into the year short on conventional resources. That's a big challenge.
But one of the criticisms of some of this legislation is that the payoff would be so much further down the line to something that Ben is describing as an immediate crisis. But you also hear from people who are in the marketplace that some of it just wasn't written well.
Well, fast drafting of big spending is hard. And actually, the Democrats tried to get the bill done on a party line basis and do it in a hurry. That was also hard. What's ahead is harder still. They have to spend a lot of money and do it really fast. If Republicans take over Washington in 2024, some of the unobligated balances could be targeted. Now, the tax credits, about $270 billion of the $370 billion that are in the bill, if you look at history, the last long-term extension of solar tax credits was in 2008, and it was projected by the Joint Committee on Taxation at about $3 billion over 10 years. Came in at 4 times that amount. The credits, a lot of them in the IRA, are uncapped. There's no limit on them. And when the government hands out free money, it usually gets a lot of takers. So no, not an immediate result, but potentially much bigger than forecast.
But Ben, when you talk about climate change, it sounds like it's one little box. But what you're talking about is financial investment. We're talking about geopolitics. We're talking about local government. It's a huge beat you have here, Ben. But on the sliver of it with geopolitics, talk to me about why this spike in prices for gas and oil in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine hasn't actually led quickly to going green. In fact, it made for dirtier energy investment, right, with coal.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of tension there because as those natural gas supplies were lessened to Europe, they had to turn to other forms of energy. So you did see a ramp up in coal use. There's actually a lot of analysts who are saying this eventually will more quickly accelerate this clean energy transition because you now have Europe looking at Russia and saying, we can't count on this in the future. So we need to more quickly transition to other forms of energy like renewables, so solar and wind. You guys mentioned nuclear power, and that's a really interesting one because you've had this real reconsideration of nuclear power because it is a form of clean and reliable energy. And here in California, you've actually seen there's one nuclear plant still operating in this state. It's called Diablo Canyon, and that was going to be mothballed, and they have reversed that decision. The governor came out and said, we need this because we don't have enough renewable energy yet to make this transition off of fossil fuels.
But that's a difficult local government problem because people in this country often don't want nuclear plants in their backyard. They don't want mining and that kind of local production happening.
You're going to have this real tension all over this country if we want to mine these things domestically, these critical elements for the future of energy. They are going to be in somebody's backyard. They are going to be in places where people may not want them. The question is that a trade-off versus getting it from a place like China and having them control that supply chain? So that's a real tension. That's a real tension for President Biden and his own party.
Well, that's what's interesting is President Biden wants to go green, but not only is coal and natural gas cheap, but when you go green, it also makes us in some ways dependent on China, as Ben just said there, for the elements that go into, for example, electric vehicle batteries. Kevin, how does that shift actually happen? How do you convince Americans that the drilling needs to happen in their backyard versus bringing these in from other places in Africa and China?
Well, Margaret, it's a question mark whether we can. Indeed, a lot of what we're looking at right now for the Biden administration is a tension between rapid deployment and the development of a domestic industry. And so solar panels are a big example of this. A lot of them come from China, and a lot of the solar material that goes into those panels comes from a region where there's forced labor allegations that are quite serious. And the question will be, how are we going to balance human rights with the green agenda? And the administration has been struggling with that. But the other part of it, though, is that how are we going to get development inside the borders of the United States? Globalization made it easier to tighten environmental laws because industry went overseas. Now we're trying to bring it home. And the question will be, how can we do that in a way that's compatible with our stricter environmental rules?
And just to underscore your point, the Department of Energy reports China controls 80% of rare earths. Those are the ingredients Ben was talking about in production and refining. That goes into generators for wind turbines. China controls 61% of global lithium refineries for battery storage and electric vehicles. You can't go green right now without China.
It's true. And deglobalizing was inflationary enough. Buying new stuff was inflationary. If you're going to put new infrastructure in place, it has a financial cost. How are we going to do this without going through China? Well, the answer is we can't, not right away.
I want to ask you about pricing. We had these nightmare scenarios going back to fossil fuels of oil at like $125 a barrel in the new year. Are we past that? Are we still in that potential for a real severe spike?
We are stuck in the middle of a structural shortage, Margaret. Not only did we have underinvestment, but the shunning of Russian energy that we're doing now is leaving a hole in the supply picture. If gas isn't going into Europe on pipelines that it used to traverse, it's coming off the water from other countries. What are they burning instead? Well, some of them are burning oil. In other words, energy is tight everywhere because there's less of it in the world right now. As we look ahead, you ask, well, what's going to change? And we're seeing new infrastructure risks, new risks that whether you're looking at Iran attacking Saudi infrastructure or the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage this year, the Colonial Pipeline hack here in the U.S., or just the matter of fires, floods, and freezes getting in the way of production. These challenges to supply are starting to mount. And so it's a pretty good expectation that we're going to be living in a time of scarcity for a while. It's changing our thinking, but slowly. We bought a lot of big cars when energy was cheap.
And scarcity means high prices.
I do mean high prices.
All right. Kevin Book, great to have you here. Ben, thanks for joining us. We'll be right back.
That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.